Y'all, Wizard101 is releasing teaser after teaser for the upcoming Darkmore update, and today we need to talk about the upcoming changes to every spear and trap in the game. In case y'all have somehow never interacted with these, spears are basically blades that give pierce. Traps are just damage buffs that you put on your opponent instead of yourself, like a blade. And all of these are getting changed. It looks like they're doing a pretty massive pierce and damage buff audit that affects a bunch of spells for every single school. So I thought we would go through the teasers, talk about how they're going to affect the game. Starting right off, this is what they're going to be doing to every single spear in the game, and even other spells that give you pierce. Now, compared to the live round version of Storm Spears, y'all can see we're getting a real buff. 20% to all the way up to 30% in PvE, right? If you're encountering like a tower shield, an elemental shield, a spirit shield, these new spears, as long as you have just a little bit of pierce, will actually almost completely negate that shield. That's a big deal because I would argue that pierce only really happens at max level when you get those circle jewels unlocked and you start adding pierce jewels. That really only happens around level 100. Until then, even with really meta gear, shields are a very, very big nuisance. Now you can actually train in Avalon all of these pierce blades. And what's very, very important to note is that with 30% being on the table, you could actually stack it with elemental and spirit spears and really get that 50% pierce, which is really your magic number in PvE. I don't think it's any coincidence that they're doing this in the same update where a bunch of shadow spells are changing. If y'all don't know, right, Shadow Strike is probably not even gonna do what it does right now. And while there is most certainly gonna be, probably anyways, a shadow creature, a shadow transformation that gives you pierce, it's going to be using the new pact system, right? Where in order to reduce your lash, you have to do a whole other set of things that form likes in order to get that pierce. Now, there's a real chance in PvE anyways that whatever the shadow audit isn't going to be too crazy. I think it's still good that we have more options now than ever to actually use pierce without taking lash whatsoever. Now, what's crazy is that this little pierce audit actually affects two other spells that involve using auras. So one of these spells is Cosmic Charge. Now, this is a pierce aura that you basically learn as you just train more and more astral spells. Now, you literally have to train Infal to train Cosmic Charge, but right now it's very weird. It's one entire pip. It is like a 4-round aura, just like all the other ones, but it's only 20% pierce, which makes no sense to, because like Stabilize is 0 pips and it's still 25% defense, right? This is a defensive aura. It looks like, according to the teaser anyways, now Cosmic Charge is going to be able to completely undo a brace, because 25 pierce perfectly undoes the 25% resist you get from brace. But this little 1 pip cost is really weird to me. Let's not forget, right? This is an astral spell, meaning, right, the stat that you would be able to use an odd pip spell and still get a pip if you had a power pip, right? Pip conserve, it doesn't apply. I always tend to explain pip conserve because a lot of people don't get it, but basically, right, pip conserve is generally a school specific stat, but all it means is, right, let's say that I use a 5 pip spell like Bunyips, but I only have 6 pips. Pip conserve gives you a % chance of getting that 1 pip that you're essentially wasting right back. Right, at least if Astral Magic was easy to pip conserve with, people would use this Cosmic Charge more, but I still don't even see the new and improved version of it being that good. That being said, the other pierce aura that we do have access to, this one looks very, very promising. It's called Courageous Charge. And really, I could see this being used on any school, but basically, right, I guess you would need a balance pip, right? Because it's two pips to use, so you need like a power pip to use it. But for using a balance pip, what it uses is this echo mechanic that balance has. If your opponent has an aura, you're basically doing a little bit of damage and getting a 25% pierce aura based on this teaser. Now, that's really, really good if you have like a debuff on, like a weakness, or you're trying to, like, I don't know, break a tower shield. Right, this is a very, very common occurrence that happens both in PvP and PvE, especially if you're stacking buffs and you want a way to get rid of debuffs without using those buffs. Right, imagine I have like a Storm Blade, a Storm Trap, and all of that already set up, and my opponent's shields are weaknesses, but they have an aura out. With this new Courageous Charge, not only could I get rid of the weakness, get rid of the shield, I could also basically negate a brace worth of resist with the pierce that I get because it echoes. I'm definitely seeing situations where this could be used in PvE, but otherwise, I'd say the spears themselves very, very usable in PvE regardless. Now, the other update is a pretty massive buff to all traps, I guess, in the game right now, and this is basically what they tease. Notably, it looks like Balance, which has a 30% universal trap, right? This is like the iconic hex spell. Looks like this one isn't changing. I guess they're basically like sticking with the idea that Balance Blade and Hex, which are universal buffs, are still weaker. I guess that makes sense because you could literally use a Balance Blade or a Hex on any school of magic. But it does look like now we have 40% traps for every single school, including Fuel, which I honestly think cements Fire as one of the best trapping schools in the game. Obviously, let's not forget, right? Potent Trap does exist, and you can stack potent traps with regular versions of that trap. What this basically means is instead of Blades being the best buffs, now traps are the best buffs, as long as you're stacking with things like Potent Trap, right? For example, if I were a Storm, I could potent a Storm Trap and stack it with a regular Storm Trap. That is back-to-back 50% buff into a 40% buff. That is way better than Blades are right now, especially considering that these are 0 pip. Why do they do this? I think the answer is very, very obvious. Blades are simply more versatile than traps because of overtimes, right? If I were to blade into an overtime like Iron Curse, for example, that blade will apply on the entirety of the overtime. But if I were to trap, that trap is on the opponent, right? And if I did this overtime, that trap would only apply on that little 65, which is a very small part of that overtime. Not to mention there's other things that don't use traps that optimally, like double hits in the case of Minotaur, Immortal Gaze. There's also triple hits in the game like Hydra, Scales, and other things that we've seen Balance getting over the years, right? There's a lot of things that just will use traps way less optimally. Of course, if you play the game, you've seen that, right? Other than Feints, I'd argue traps are not preferred over Blades. But now, depending on which single hit you use, I would argue that these traps are easily the best buffs in the game. I will say this. With the combination of these traps and Blades, I could see nothing but good things coming out of this for PvE. However, I would argue that PvP has a pretty massive problem with one-shot strategies and how formulaic they are. And what do I mean by one-shot strategies? I literally mean strategies where literally the only spells that are cast by the opponent are Blades and traps. This is honestly why you'll see most high rank decks, they'll have like an answer to it, like Rebirth and Scarecrow. These are trap and Blade counters. But here's the thing, you could pack a lot of Rebirths, you could pack a lot of Scarecrows, but at the end of the day, if someone's just packing more copies of buffs, you will end up losing as a result of that, because eventually they'll just outbuff all of your counters. This is especially true when you're going against schools like Myth that can hit through debuffs, and even people that run Myth as a secondary and literally ignore their primary school. A lot of lives do this because their base stats are so good, and they can still heal using their life identity. So these traps, as long as they're actually somewhat trainable or even accessible, they're actually going to make the problem worse, especially when we're thinking about TC versions of these that you can literally just spam. We saw in yesterday's set of teasers that there are slightly more potent trap counters. However, they're not as good as, in my opinion, just someone spamming traps because of a simple fact. If someone's entire deck is traps and Blades, it'll never be able to be outcompeted by someone unless their entire deck is trap and Blade counters. But the second you go against someone not using Blades and traps, because you're actually trying to make a deck that deals with a wide variety of things, you're automatically at a massive disadvantage. This isn't like a new problem. I don't really think that this is something that's like gonna be fully caused by the advent of these more powerful spears and traps. Both buffs that will help you one-shot opponents, right? But if they do go forward with this, I would love to see things like, you know, trap pushing and blade stealing become a larger part of certain schools' identity. So those things, right, they would really belong to Fire and Death, because Fire leverages traps and counters traps. Death also leverages Blades and counters Blades. That's like just how their identity overlap. I'd love to see more accessible spells where, let's say that the meta really gets into like blading and trapping like crazy. It'd be nice to be able to push these more powerful traps back onto an opponent, be able to steal Blades over to yourself, and then use them using like a secondary into Fire or Death. That's really not an option. The only spells that currently do that are Nautilus and like Snack Attack. They're pretty hard to use and they're very high in pips. Right, for me to actually use Nautilus and punish one trap that's on me, I have to get 30 fire accuracy, I have to get a fire pip, and then I have to push a trap, and they could just trap again. Right, spells like these, I would love to see better versions of them at lower pips that are more utility forward, both for death and fire. I do think that's something that they've hinted at. Things like swapping dots and swapping, you know, blades and traps that are more not on balance, but on other schools where their identity kind of like, you know, like justifies that. I think that's what we really need to be seeing very, very soon. Otherwise, in PvP, these are just going to make that whole one-shot problem a little bit worse. That being said, I'm very, very happy that the pure stuff is actually going to be a valid substitute to Strike. I think a lot of people were a little bit worried about Strike, and I think it goes without saying, right? In PvE, more versatile buffs, stronger buffs, that is definitely going to be a good thing. But I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on the fact that they're buffing both traps and pierce in this update. Do y'all think the game needed that? Do y'all think it's just like, you know, too much because like it'll actually unbalance things? Or do y'all think that it's fine, but the counters need to be a little bit better? There's a lot of ways this could go. I do think it's very interesting how much they're doing with this update, but the biggest thing that we can do is give them feedback while test realm is active. So I look forward to reading all of y'all's thoughts in the comments. Drop a like if you enjoyed, leave a sub review, and as always, if somebody hasn't told you you're awesome today, they doing something wrong. Stay awesome, y'all. See y'all soon. And yeah, y'all.